Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. My name's Roz. I'm a senior conference producer at Sustainable Aviation Futures, and we are delighted to be hosting this webinar, Unlocking SAF Investment, What Will It Take to Unlock FID in collaboration with Johnson Matthey. Johnson Matthey is a global leader in sustainable technologies, applying cutting-edge science to create solutions with their customers that make a real difference to the world. In the SAF space specifically, Johnson Matthey and their partners have created solutions to convert waste and biomass feedstocks or green hydrogen and CO2 into sustainable crude oils. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will be discussing what FID really means for SAF projects, lessons from taking a SAF plant to FID, aligning airline demand with project financing needs, what it takes to make projects bankable, risk transfer and insurance as pathways to FID, engineering, delivery, and execution risk, and the big question, what needs to change to accelerate FID? Finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, just a couple of bits of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and it will be distributed to you once the webinar finishes. So if you have to leave for any reason, you won't miss out, although I recommend staying so you can be part of the Q&A. On that, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please ask any questions you have in that box and we will do our best to answer them, although it's a full discussion, so I can't promise we'll get to them all. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to today's brilliant moderator, Anna Davies, the Renewable Fuels Lead at Bloomberg NEF. So Anna, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much, Roz. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here because I think this is a really, really important topic for the world of sustainable aviation fuel. And that is basically how do we get these projects to the point of final investment decision and under construction. Final investment decision, FID, is a key turning point for taking projects from paper to actual execution. And it's absolutely essential milestone in their journey. By BNEF's count, by Bloomberg NEF's count, we see about 50 operational SAF plants out there today, with an additional 42 or so that have secured financing, successfully completed this FID process. But there's still over 150 projects in the planning phases that have not yet reached that milestone. Additionally, if we look back over the last few years, we count at least 50 projects that have hoped to produce SAF, SAF, but have stalled or paused or been fully abandoned. So while SAF is undoubtedly essential to decarbonize aviation, this process is by no means easy or guaranteed. So luckily, I'm joined by an excellent group here today to discuss what is needed for FID and how can these projects that are in the planning stages work to reach that milestone. I'm joined by, as you can see here, Paul Ticehurst from Johnson Matthey, Jonathan Council from IAG Group, Alfonso Garcia de las Heras from Repsol, Urbano Troncoso Perez, I'm sorry, Urbano, from Santander, and Katie Lennon from AXA Insurance. And so they'll be discussing with me their tips and tricks for reaching FID for about the next 40 or 45 minutes of discussion. And then we will turn to audience Q&A. So as Roz said, please do put your questions in the chat. We'd love to hear what's on your mind as well. Before we jump right in, I believe there's a short survey, especially if you're a developer of a SAF project. We'd love to see where you are in the planning phase. And we have a little video to show you that you can watch while you're filling out the survey. So Roz, I'm going to turn it over for you to bring those two up. Please let us know if you can't see the survey.
Welcome. I'm Syngas 1.0, and I'm here to show you the future of air travel. FT Cans is a one-of-a-kind technology helping deliver sustainable aviation fuel, no matter what your feedstock. Syngas 1.0, deactivating in 3, 2, 1.
Great. Well, that's exciting. That really gets the energy going up this morning. All right. So I think we should just dive in. I guess let's start with Paul, perhaps. We just saw the video on Johnson Matthey, so clearly Johnson Matthey is well involved in the SAF processes. And from your view, especially as a technology developer, you've seen a lot of these projects try to get to FID, go through this process. In your view, what does it mean what does FID readiness really mean? What does it entail?
Yeah, no, thanks. So for me, being FID ready means the SAF project is fully defined. It's got clarity on all its costs, so that's both its capital and investment costs, as well as the operating costs. It knows its timelines, its production quantities, its revenues. In addition, and probably as most importantly in this nascent industry that we're in, it really understands its overall risk portfolio. So that's off-taker risks. Who are the buyers? Who's lined up ready to purchase the fuel in the long term? What's the feedstock risk? Have you got a solid understanding of the costs, the availability of the feedstocks? There's policy risk. What are the incentives that are being considered and how are they achieved? Construction risk with the EPC contracting strategy fully developed and the project team established, including the owner's engineer or maybe even the EPCM. You've got to think about the operational risk. So what's the operating strategy? So developing, and leading to informed decisions around the facility uptime. From Johnson Matthey perspective, technology risk is key. You need to have a really clear design and technology pathway in place with robust designs from proven licensors that provide the confidence to both the investors and the EPC. And then you've got additional risk mitigation through the appropriate involvement of insurance specialists. And in our opinion, to do all of these things, the best way to do that is to really engage the stakeholders at an early stage so that everyone's on the same page and you're all working together on the same plans.
Great. So just a little bit of things to work out through the kinks of it all.
Yeah.
Just a little bit, yeah. Maybe let's turn then to Alfonso. Repsol, as our token producer on the call, you've navigated this process, right? I believe you have the Bilbao demonstration facility and then the Puerto Llano facility as well that have financing secured, I believe, and are on track for development. Can you tell us the status of those facilities and your experience sort of navigating the FID process, all of those risks that Paul outlined? What were some of the biggest hurdles for you and what was your strategy in overcoming them?
Well, thank you, Anna. I think, I suppose it's all come down to risk and how you manage the risk. So every project or every situation is different to each other. In my view, there are three elements that define the overall risk of a project. The first one is who is behind the project, who is the sponsor. What is the background of this sponsor? What is the strength in terms of financing? If you have access to different mechanisms, to debt, to equity. The second is the experience that also Paul mentioned. What is the experience of this sponsor on processing and producing fuels? Do you have experience on operation or maintenance on industrial facilities? Also, if you already have some facilities in operation, like the came in Repsol, so it is completely different for the approach of permitting or insurance in case that you are developing a greenfield project or a brownfield project is completely different. And also the integration that you have, if you have integrated the upstream supply chains, if you have access to different quality, different fuel supply, feedstock supplier, but also in the downstream. Now, SAF is a drop-in fuel, but it is limited capital, has to be blended with traditional fossils. So how do you manage this fossil, the quality, if you want to avoid some off-spec? So this is also important. So clearly the sponsor is one of the main elements that define the overall risk project. The second is the technology. The technology that we see right now in this transformation, there are technologies that are less complex or more mature to produce SAF, like co-processing or HEFA are a clear example of this one. However, there are other technologies that are not fully proven commercial. So these include a new risk that we didn't have in the past. And this technology clearly defines as well, which is the feedstock that you can use, what is the quality, what is the key parameters that limit the availability of this feedstock, and also the possibility to diversify your product. You can only produce SAF, or are you able to diversify your product to HVO for road transport or maritime sector? And this is also important. And the last but not least, I think, is the market itself. We don't have to forget that we are in a regulated market that is clearly driven by regulation. So in this sense, in Europe, we have the more mature regulation. However, probably it's the more complex. So we have direct mandates. We have indirect mandates. Indirect mandates, we have one specific for road transport, is the RED 3. We have the refuel aviation that clearly puts some obligation on aircraft operators, but also on fuel suppliers. Then we have probably the most agnostic, that is the EU Maritime, that establishing some GHG reduction. So this ecosystem is very complex. So it's important understanding and trying to predict the potential future step of this regulation in order to be able to adapt and to build a project that is resilient to these effects. So just to conclude, I would like to give an example. No, I think it's well known that during 2025, the European producers of SAF were not competitive with the importers. So I think it's key. Is this technology that you have selected, all the ecosystem allow you to switch to another product like the HBO. So in that case, you are able to manage this situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think there's a lot to dig into there. So that's a really good setup for all the different pieces we can discuss on this call. I might actually turn it now to Katie. Let's bring in the insurance side of these things, because we were talking about a lot of risks here. We've got a whole slew of them, for everything from technology risk to developer risk to policy risk. What is the role of insurance? How can you help the insurance side of things help address these risks? And which ones are you best suited for? What do you see a lot of developers coming to you now asking for assistance? Where do you fit in?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And I just have to say, it's so refreshing to join an industry conversation where the conversation is about risk, and I'm not sat on the side really trying to tease out that conversation. I think that real awareness of this industry, which is still relatively immature, right? Like, it's still quite a young industry, is really considering risk at this early stage and recognizes the value in that. So that's really exciting. Paul, you mentioned straight away the importance of this early stakeholder engagement, and that is the real key message that the insurance industry is putting out around this industry, that importance of early engagement. And what we mean by that is at this like preconception stage, right? So just seeing the results of the poll come through, and I think it looks like 90% of folks, right, are in the stage where they're saying you should be engaging with an insurance company, and really thinking about an insurance partner that is interested in reducing risk across the whole life cycle of the assets that you want to build and operate. Because there is a huge amount of value that the insurance industry delivers at the financing stage, as well as the more traditional insurance products that you think of when you need insurance for your construction, for your operation, for the D&O to protect the folks at the top making the decisions. Places like AXA XL have invested a huge amount in our risk consulting teams, and that's because we know that we're navigating something new here. So that early engagement is really critical in helping those experts come in to help de-risk your projects early on. So that opportunity actually to engineer out risk at that design stage should ultimately deliver that long-term value as well, when you think about the risk associated with your assets throughout their life cycle. And then when we think about the financing stage, the solutions that the insurance industry offers to the financing stage, I think are relatively either not understood or underappreciated, but there's a huge amount of value to be unlocked there. And we think about it in a way which is about getting the right risks onto the right balance sheets to make everybody comfortable, right? So who's got what appetite for what risk? So as an example, and not to put Urbano on the spot here, but a lot of financiers don't necessarily like technology risk. But that is something that can sit on the balance sheet of an insurer. So that technology performance can be transferred onto the balance sheet of an insurer through a technology performance insurance product. And when we're thinking about these earlier stage technologies, that's when we see the highest demand for that kind of product. There's also a huge offering from the industry on credit insurance. So if we think that the credit is one of the riskier elements, that can also be transferred to the insurance industry. There's political risk that can be transferred to the insurance industry, and there are things like weather risk if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, all those kinds of things. So it's all about, for us, the right risk on the right balance sheet and making sure you're using the whole ecosystem to say, how do we get the project to that financial decision, and using all of the financial services industry to get yourself to unlocking that decision.
That's fascinating. I don't even think I knew that all those risks could be addressed through insurance. So a really good one. And I think that's a good pivot. I mean, you basically led it for me. Urbano, let's bring you in as the bank, as the one actually doing this financing. What's your take on all of this? Katie's mentioned how insurance should be engaged early on. When do you think is the right time for the banks to start being engaged as well?
Right. No, so thank you very much for that. I think that what is first important for people to understand is that, I mean, SAF is not a new industry, okay? So it's something that has been on the ground, however, for many years. However, the reality is that most of the SAF plants around the world had not been project financed, okay? And I think that, okay, this might seem subtle difference for some people, but the reality is that it brings a total new set of considerations to be made when you are looking at that, okay? Because when you project finance something, that means that, okay, lenders will only have access to this asset, nothing else, right? So that means that the level of assessment that we will make of the opportunity itself will be much more thorough and deep, okay? So I think that that's the first point. Then I think that the second one is, what project finance means for financiers means that we are looking for predictability of cash flows. Okay? And I think that this is something that is really important. This is the reason why we spend so much time discussing about offtake agreements, right? Because at the end of the day, if you look at the cash flow, I think that there are three key elements in there. First one is the revenues. So, okay, are you selling the product? Price, volume, and also certification requirements from your off-takers. And if you don't have that, the reality is that it's pretty hard to assess how predictable those cash flows are going to be, right? So you don't know how much money you are going to earn, and consequently, if you are going to be able to repay your debt. The second element is, okay, you say, now I know how much money I'm going to earn, but how much is it going to cost me to produce this product? So then it's like, okay, do I have my feedstock secure? And this is where we start entering into the discussion about CO2 and hydrogen, if we are discussing SAF, or all the UCO or other forms of biomass when we are discussing other SAF. Okay, so exactly the same. If I have a lot of variability on this side of the equation, it's pretty hard to define my margin, because let's remember that is the margin what we are trying to secure. And then you have in the middle everything related with, how do I transform this input into this output? So that's technology. And in order to have this technology operational, you have the construction, right? So, and it's exactly the point that Katie was mentioning just now. So we need to be sure that this technology is going to perform at a certain level and is going to do it consistently. And definitely, I think that there you have some technologies that are more mature, and definitely we can rely on this historic data. But in some cases, those are new technologies with limited track record. And then, of course, we have some uncertainties that we don't feel so comfortable about. So once you look at all of this, then I think that everyone can understand, okay, how predictable really my cash flows are. And that means that there is some residual risks that need to be sitting with the right party. And this is the second principle of project finance, is that everyone or every risk has to be allocated to the party that is best positioned to manage it, right? And sometimes we see people saying, okay, technological risk needs to go to banks. I mean, Do we really think that banks are the ones that are best positioned to manage the technology risk? I think that probably the answer is no. So I think that there is where definitely insurance can play a role, right? And it's quite important. And the reality is that when you look at all of these, we are trying to solve a problem that is relatively new for everyone. Because as I mentioned, project finance has not been used for SAF in the past. So what that means is that we need to be engaged as soon as possible, or let's say relatively early on. So then we can together come up with a solution that makes everyone feels comfortable. We see many people trying to solve those problems on an isolated basis, and then they're approaching us and we're telling them, look, unfortunately, I don't feel comfortable with this risk, and there is not a perfect solution. So that means that either you change the risk or you will not be able to raise non-recourse financing or project finance, what makes projects getting delayed. So I think that definitely we are really happy to work with projects to get to this stage, but that means that we need some time and we need to be brought in early enough so then we can work with them.
Great, that's fascinating. Luckily, I think it looks like there's 32% of the people on this call are still in the concept development and another 27% technology selection. So it sounds like now is a good time for them to be listening in and linking up with Katie and Urbano. I want to bring in Jonathan because one of the big pieces you mentioned there, Urbano, was offtake risk. And I think the word offtake, that was the first time we've mentioned the word offtake in this call, but it's obviously a key component towards getting these projects looking very feasible and ready for FID. Jonathan, IAG, probably one of the biggest SAF off-takers out there at the moment. What is it? What do you see the role of airlines? What can they be expected to do and not? And how do you try and approach helping these projects sort of move forward? What do you look for when you're looking for offtake?
Yeah, no, thank you, Anna, and great to join you this afternoon. And just first to say that, IAG, we see SAF will play an absolutely critical role in helping us deliver our targets. We think by 2050, up to 70% of our fuel could be SAF. But the critical role for airlines is to provide, long-term committed take-or-pay offtake agreements, which is where we focus. And it's quite a big move for us because most of our jet fuel deals, they're 1 or 2 year deals. So just a couple of examples, we did a 14-year offtake agreement with a power-to-liquid company called 12, and we did a 10-year offtake agreement with another power-to-liquid company called Infinium. That took quite a long time for us to get through our internal governance, to convince our executive team and then our board. These were the right approach to take and the thing that we can do to help those projects raise capital. And again, consistent with every other previous piece here, is it's all about the risk. And so, how do we manage the risk of those long-term contracts? And the three that I'll particularly pull out are technology redundancy. So, if you're doing a 14-year contract, how do you know that a new technology is not going to come along and leapfrog this one and it makes your one redundant? So, do a lot of due diligence around ensuring that you understand the importance of this technology and how resilient it is to any of those potential risks. The other one's called price risk. So if you're giving committed price, what is the risk that something's going to come along and be able to provide that at a much lower cost? So you're locking yourself into high price SAF potentially. And again, it's really making sure you do the full due diligence, you understand the cost drivers. Particularly, so for power to liquid, it's really fundamentally about availability of cost-effective renewable power. So you understand that dynamic, and potentially you could build that in as an index to your cost pricing and so on. If you think that you don't want to take that risk, but really understanding that and that piece, and then the final bit for us is policy risk. And maybe we can talk about that more in it, but that is really key, and it's so relevant at the moment. We have the mandates in the EU and the UK, and generally they're great. They create demand, so that's fine. They won't create necessary investment. You need to supplement them with incentives. But even within those mandates, they have these sub targets for power to liquids, and 2G SAF here in the UK, which we support because we're not going to do it all with 1G SAF, but it's quite clear that. There could be some challenges in meeting those near-term requirements. So that's something that we're watching very closely and happy to talk more about.
Yeah, I think actually maybe diving into policy is a good transition point at this point. We're almost halfway through And I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. But policy is a huge component of this all. And I'd love to hear, Urbano, Katie, Paul, even Alfonso, how you've experienced things. How do you view policy? Because there's a lot of policies being developed. There's a lot of different types of policies. And then there's this question of, can you trust the policies? I'm sitting in New York, so I'm well aware that in the US at least, right, policies can change in a heartbeat. I'm going to open this up, so just jump in as you see fit. I feel like probably everybody has thoughts on this, but how do you think about policy risk, and how should projects that, inherently SAF is based on policy, how should they also think about this? What can we do to mitigate policy risk? Who's brave enough to jump in first? Yeah, Urbano, I saw you unmute first. Let me put Urbano and then Katie.
No, look, I think that the worst thing that can happen with policy is that we start having doubts about it. Because the reality is that, okay, I think that we have made a lot of progress. So we have mandates, and I know that we all would like things to be perfect. Unfortunately, we are in the real world, and we know that things never are, or there are always some nuances to regulation. But the reality is that we already have mandates in some jurisdictions, and I think that this is potentially creating demand. What I think that is positive. Secondly, I think that regulators realize that, as Jonathan was mentioning, only having these incentives probably is not going to be enough, or was not going to be enough. And then they decided to start thinking about the next step. That is, okay, how we bridge the gap between willingness to pay, and let's say the actual cost or production cost, and then we are starting to see these revenue certainty mechanism discussions in the UK. We are starting to see these double-side auctions in Europe, and HINDCO and so many other initiatives, which of course, take time to develop, but I think that definitely could help to bridge the gap and to make the first projects bankable. But definitely what we cannot live with is doubts around those policies, right? So I think that so far what I've seen, regulators have been relatively clear, is that the intention is to keep those mandates and to keep those policies. But of course, I can tell you that the worst thing for financiers, and I would say investors in general, is to have uncertainty or doubts about those policies. We have seen this in other sectors or in other asset classes in the past, and I can refer to renewables in Spain, for example, where definitely there were relevant changes in the policies. And then we saw investors move away from an asset class for many years, and I think that, okay, we definitely need to have this certainty here if we want to start seeing the first multi-billion plants being built and taking off. So I really hope that this is not going to be the case, and I think that we should just operate as is, if what politicians are saying was going to be the case, because otherwise, I think that we are creating uncertainty, and this is the worst. It's better to have bad policy than to have uncertainties, I would say.
Yes, it's a great point, Urbano, and it goes to what the implications are for insurers are as well. So when we think about the urgency of some policy changes and the timelines that those work over, it's really important for the insurance industry to stay abreast of policy changes, to make sure that, for starters, we're not a barrier to that change and the speed at which it needs to go at, but also so that we understand our role in it and the value that we're adding, so that we achieve that early engagement of de-risking that uncertainty and de-risking that change for clients and operators and investors. And one of the examples that really came to mind was, if people are aware of it, the IMO 2020 change around sulfur dioxides in the marine sector, with a really different intent to that policy, right, around worker health and safety. But one of the impacts on the insurance industry was an uptick in claims because of the changes, the retrofitting that was happening to those engines to make sure that the fuel change could be accepted. It didn't necessarily disrupt the industry, but the cost to the industry was greater because there was a greater incident risk of damage to the engines. And the speed at which that policy came in, I think, with earlier engagement with the insurance industry, some of those things had potential to be de-risked a little bit earlier. When we think about SAF policy in the same way, we're making sure that we're close to policy changes to try and help play that role.
Alfonso, I'd be interested in hearing your view as a developer. How do you think about policy impacting the business? And I think you've mentioned a few times, and maybe this is not your answer, but you mentioned a few times about co-products, and sometimes you can sort of adjust what you're producing based on the market dynamics. But yeah, how are you thinking about the policy developments and policy uncertainty?
I think Silvano touched one point that is important, is the worst thing for a policy is that to be unpredictable, no? And in some cases we are developing project and there is still change on the regulation. So that's clearly impact the project. So when you are developing a project, you are expecting that you can have some change, but the sooner the better. Once you are developing a project, all these changes affect, no? So this is one point. The second point that I mentioned before is that we in Europe we have a very complex regulatory framework. So we have different policies for different sectors. Sometimes they don't fit each other. So it is really complex to understand exactly the policies. In some cases is not agnostic, so they are limiting the solution and limiting the technologies that you can use. So this is another risk that we need to manage. Of course, this is not the only one, but this is one that is important. So, and regarding the byproducts, I think this is critical because in the refinery that we have right now, that we've been operating for many years, we put some inputs and we take many products. So this is a business with a high CapEx and low margins. So if we are not able to take advantage of the product that we are producing, we are not going to be competitive. If we put all the costs that we have only in one product, it has no sense for the economical. But from the technical point of view, the thermodynamic is there. So we can not only produce one product. I would like just only produce one product, but it has no sense from the technical point of view, because that means to increase your cost of production, the cost of energy, the consumption of utilities, and so on. So this is also important, and this is related with an agnostic policy. So I think if we have an agnostic policy looking to reduce the GHG emission, that is the final target, we have to take advantage of the product and all the solution that we can provide.
Great. Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing I'd like to get into, I think a few of you have touched on this already, but I'm guessing given the early stage a lot of our listeners are on, we probably have a lot of non-HEFA technology projects being developed, right? And Jonathan, it was interesting to hear your two examples are long-term offtakes of e-fuel supply. How do you think, how do these kind of new technologies, we've talked about it across this, but what advice do you have, especially if somebody is developing sort of a novel tech or first of a kind, second of a kind project coming to market? What's your best advice for these technology providers? What would you look for, I guess, as an airline to secure off?
Yeah, and that's all. We don't. So we classify the market between 1G, 2G, 3G. 1G is sort of HEFA, and all SAF today is HEFA. 2G is typically alcohol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, and the gasification Fischer-Tropsch pathway, and then finally 3G is eSAF, power to liquids. And we're absolutely clear that the global potential for 1G, 30 to 40 million tons. As an industry, we're going to need 500 million tons, which is why we fully support the policy options that are trying to stimulate early investment in 2 and 3G capacity, because ultimately the majority, 90% of all SAF is going to come through these more advanced technologies. So, if you're thinking about, I want to get into the 2-3G market, it's look at those pathways that have been approved, because they have to get, this ASTM approval. The lead times to achieving that can be challenging. So, get into those technologies that have already either achieved technical approval or are likely to, and also it's the feedstock availability. So that's the other key thing. And what are the drivers of cost, and what is the feedstock availability? And it varies by region. So the UK has got a very different profile of SAF pathways going to work here than, say, in the US and so on. So, for instance, we think that the gasification FT route is quite attractive in the UK because we have lots of municipal solid waste. We still have 20 million tonnes a year of MSW that goes to landfill. And local authorities have to pay a landfill tax. And it's quite expensive, and it's going to get more expensive. So there's already quite a powerful economic enabler to support the business case for, gasification Fischer-Tropsch pathway. So those are key. We and saying that, and this sort of links to the policy risk question. So while we support these sub targets, and obviously we absolutely don't want to create any policy uncertainty. We think that the regulators have to be alert to where there's risk in, so some of those targets were set 5 years ago, and the classic one we look at is in the EU. You've got powder liquid sub target of 1.2% by 2030. That's 600,000 tonnes a year of powder liquid. Today there's none, or there's very little. And of course, if it's not supplied, there's going to be buyout. Now we see, absolutely we have to avoid buyout. That is just failure for everybody. This is the penalty that the supplier pays if they can't meet the sub target. And for powder liquid, it is very expensive. So you'll be getting into, we understand as a short-term pressure valve where there's difficult supply, fine. But if there's going to be wholesale and large scale over a long time period of buyout, then that is just policy failure. And I think it puts at risk the whole momentum around mandates. So I think definitely don't mess with the overall structure of the policy instrument. We support mandates, but you've got to be alert where there's particular risk and, amend where it's appropriate. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Paul, let me bring you in. If we're talking about these sort of non-HEPA technologies, Johnson Matthey, Key, how do you help with this technology risk or technology uncertainty for these producers?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, just to echo what Jonathan was saying, it's about making sure you've got a proven pathway, an approved pathway, so that when you're talking to the off-takers, they have certainty that they can use that fuel. And FT is approved both for gasification and for the e-fuel, so that's obviously a good one to be working with. There is technology risk. This is a nascent market, but so what we do as a technology provider is make sure that we've got a lot of proof points. And we've got a lot of all the R&D and all the work that goes behind that to make sure that when we're offering something to the market, we can stand behind it with our full guarantees. Guarantees are only worth so much, right? But having a great balance sheet helps there. But the other thing that we do with our customers is we enable them to do any due diligence that they want to do, and the same for the lenders and the same for insurance companies. They can come, they can see how we've been developing the different technologies, what we've proven with the technology, so they've got absolute confidence that the project is going to work. We also work very closely with the EPCs to make sure they understand what they're going to be building. Because as a technology provider, we provide the blueprint and we provide the pixie dust that makes sure it's all going to work. But it's the EPC that actually builds it. So having a really strong teamwork with that EPC and with the client and the client's owner's engineer, so that we're all pulling in the same direction, means that we're at what is installed meets our requirements, meets the customer requirements, and will work.
Interesting. That's a good point about the difference, the difference between technology providers and the EPC and the engineers of the client itself. A lot of stakes at play. I'd like to turn one more sort of broad category of risks, and then we can kind of get to some of the questions, but is geographic. We're seeing a lot of new SAF development coming out of Asia, for instance, right? Asia, Middle East. All of us obviously are sitting in Europe, Americas. How do you think it differs if somebody's trying to develop a project outside of the US or Europe what are some of the key things they should be considering? Do the risks differ very much? Any thoughts around this? I guess anybody who has a thought, could turn first, I guess, to Katie and Urbano if you've been working with any clients in various parts of the world.
Yes, I think I'm happy to start. I think that, look, there are probably three elements, right? I would say the first one is when you look at technology and construction, and I think that this should be similar all over the world, right? I think that technologies are what they are, and then construction can be more or less challenging depending on the location, but let's assume that, okay, you can go over it. I think that then you have the second category, and this category is support from governments, right? And I think that there is where we are seeing really big differences, and it's because, as we discussed earlier, you have two types of policies, those that are trying to incentivize demand and those that are trying to bridge the gap between production cost and willingness to pay. And I think that definitely, the ones that are more targeting production and this gap, are probably located in certain geographies and not available all over the world, right? And this is probably affecting competitiveness of some of these projects. And then I think that you have the third element, that is important to consider, and is that when financiers look at these projects, they also look at where those projects are and the risk associated with these locations, right? And I think that definitely that means that in some situations you have the country risk that can increase the cost of capital, which can have an impact. I think that definitely there are ways of going around this, but it's something that needs to be considered. I think that there, you see how development banks, export credit agencies, and all these institutions, can or should be brought to the table, in order to help commercial banks to support these projects and to avoid having a negative impact on the cost of capital. Okay, so I think that probably is something that also, coming back to the first point we discussed, starting to discuss with them early in the process will allow us to create the capital structure that would be optimal, and to reduce the cost of capital for the project.
Yeah, happy to provide an insurance lens as well. So from our perspective, it's about what risk is being transferred. So quite rightly talking about country risk, and if we're talking about credit risk or political risk, which is being transferred to an insurer, that's absolutely what we would look at. Like a number of international operators and individual operators, we have operations all over the world. We service risk, we cover risks in over 200 countries. So what we think about are the standards in country as well, and making sure that we're working with those. One of the big things that we've done as an organization when we've put together our risk consulting team is that's a team that's global in nature. So when we're looking at experts in SAF technology, it's about getting the right expert into the right country. So if we've got that expertise sat in Germany or the US, it's about making sure that we get that person to that asset to offer the right expertise. And also it means that they're able to bring their experience of projects all over the world. So they may have seen a slightly different form of that technology or a slightly different process, but the similar experience they can bring to that specific project is really valuable.
Great. Yes, go ahead, Alfonso.
Yeah, if I may add one to the third point that Urbano mentioned, I will add also the cost of energy. I think this is also important when you compare Asia with Europe. And just let me bring another example. I think, well, in the case of, for instance, the high electrolytic hydrogen, it is clear that the driver for this cost is the price of electricity. So recently has been published the outcome of the second European Hydrogen Bank auction, and it's quite surprised that only 6 projects has followed to the signed agreement. This is just 1/3 of the total allocated budget, and 7 projects drop out. No, so this is clear an example that there is an underestimation on the cost production of this hydrogen, no? And this is a novel technology. So this is also one of the things that I think in Europe we are penalized when we compare with other regions worldwide.
Yeah, that's definitely a fascinating one. I mean, obviously, especially in this field where feedstocks can vary and you're sort of handed the feedstocks at hand, I'm assuming there's a lot of benefits in some places and it's harder in others. I will turn to some of the audience questions now. I think we have about 15 minutes left. So please, if you haven't submitted questions, if you have any, throw them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One of the first ones it looks like is for Katie. How are insurance companies assessing technology risks? So we forgot to pull you into our technology risk portion of the discussion. We'll get you in now.
That's a great question, and the without being a specific engineer myself, the confidence that I can give you is when we look at the technology performance insurance product, it's a really bespoke product for every technology. So what that means is it's not off the shelf, but when you engage with an insurer on wanting a technology performance insurance, we will bring in our own engineers, our own lawyers, so we'll assess that technology with you, and it's not us risk scoring, it's about being in partnership with you as you develop that technology and us bringing that risk lens to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Urbano, any thoughts from your end on technology risks? I know you've touched on it already. You're on mute, by the way.
Apologies, I was on mute. No, I think that, well, as I mentioned, is something that definitely, banks are not extremely comfortable with. But of course, we are here and we are spending a lot of time on this industry. So that means that definitely, we are keen to take part of this risk, to accept part of this risk, and something that definitely we are doing is that we are changing the profile of the people that we have in the team. So, I mean, chemical engineer spent a long time working in the oil and gas industry. And today I'm here, so that means that definitely we understand that we also need to evolve if we want to play a role in here. So I think that is not that, okay, we expect only to play in things that are obvious or simple, right? We understand that there is some uncertainties and some risks in here. What I'm saying is that definitely the more risk you have in that area, the harder it is going to be to process this internally. Okay. But definitely, I mean, we are eager and happy to explore all options there.
Great. That's interesting.
And maybe just a final comment, something I forgot there. I think that it was mentioned earlier, but definitely what we see is that partnerships with EPCs are quite critical. So I think that definitely is the combination of having a technology that maybe is slightly newer, with an EPC that provides a strong credibility or high credibility to lenders, is something that definitely will help a lot.
That's a really important point. And don't go off mute or don't go on mute, Urbano. I think the next one's coming your way as well. What is the range of development capital that a developer should realistically expect to have on hand or need to raise in order to progress a SAF plant from concept to FID?
Well, I would say that it depends on the size of the project, but the reality is that lenders will struggle to provide development capital. Okay, so I would say that the realistic assumption would be that development will be mostly fulfilled with equity. Of course, I think that the equity providers can evolve. I would say the type of partners that they can bring to the table will evolve as the project matures. So you don't need to go day one, with the type of player that is going to be there when the project is going to be closer to ready to build. But I would say that the general assumption should be that debt is only going to come to the table when you approach ready to build the status, which probably is where most of the capital is needed, but that also means that most of the de-risking or initial de-risking needs to be completed with equity.
That makes sense. This next question, I think anybody can jump in. Jonathan, I might punt it to you first. Will an acceptance of book and claim methodology help in the road to FID? And maybe let's start this as sort of as an airline, what's your perspective on book and claim? I'm assuming I have a good example, thought, but would it move the needle?
Where we support book and claim, anything that can create flexibility. So the example we always use is that, with the EU refuel mandate, we've got 500 airports across Europe. and you maybe have 5 or 10 SAF plants. So the last thing you want is, say, at the 2% mandate level, all of those suppliers having to deliver to 500 airports. That doesn't make sense. It's not efficient. It's not even good from a sustainability point of view. So what you want is a mechanism where you can expedite the most efficient supply mechanism, i.e., if a refinery in Rotterdam, all that SAF goes into Schiphol, and you then have a transaction accounting mechanism that can deliver and apportion the costs of that SAF and the carbon attributes. So anything that creates that flexibility to create a more efficient system is good. Essentially, we'd love to go to a global book and claim. I understand why regulators have concerns around that. They'll want to see that there are robust mechanisms, particularly around sustainability assessment and so on, before they're willing to relax those kind of rules. But for instance, we've got a number of SAF contracts in the United States, and we're looking at 2G and 3G SAF supply. Currently, the way the mandates are established, we have to ship that SAF to Europe or the UK for it to qualify for the, and it's relatively small volume. So you're having to ship small volumes. This doesn't make sense. It'd be much more sensible for us to be able to, and we fly a lot to North America to just provide that fuel into our flights as they refuel in the US, but be able to claim it against the UK and EU mandates. Much more efficient for everybody, and it helps develop a global supply market. So hopefully we eventually, as regulators, get more confident around the robustness of the certification systems and the assurance systems that we can move to that global book and claim approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll see if we get there. On the policy front, and maybe I can leave you on, Jonathan, this might come your way as well. Do you think there is enough certainty in the refuel EU mandates in an eventual market price development for eSAF by 2030 for off-takers to commit to long-term contracts? So as an off-taker who's committed to long-term contracts for these kind of fuels, I guess this goes back to that question of how do you assess policy certainty?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we, first of all, we see that power liquids have to play a critical role. We think the majority of SAF by 2050 will be power liquids because of the feedstock available. There's unfortunately there's unlimited feedstock for power liquids because it's CO2 in the atmosphere. But we're absolutely clear with the government is on the flip side of that, and so you need the policy certainty to create get the offtake agreements, but you've got to avoid buyout. So you have to amend that mandate to align with the likely supply. Yeah, so there are concerns that the current 1.2% sounds low as a percentage, but it's about 600,000 tons a year from 2030. We don't think that's going to be met. So adjust that. Not necessarily get rid of it, but adjust it to align with that supply to avoid the buyout risk. But additionally, make sure you've got the incentives. So in the EU, we have so the airlines, regardless of what changes to the mandate, they've still got incentives to buy this stuff. So the SAF allowance mechanism, there's quite generous incentives for eSAF, so 95% of the price. So maintain and in fact increase those SAF allowance. Currently it's 20 million. We think they'll be used up relatively quickly. So extend those incentives. So aligned to the mandate, you're creating additional mechanisms to drive that demand. From an airline point of view, how do we manage that risk? We include it in our contract. So all of our long-term SAF supply contracts, we say that if there is any change to the policy, that enables us to reduce our need to offtake. So use contracts to protect yourself as well against any significant policy change.
Urbano, any thoughts on that approach?
It's a tricky question. So I fully understand the point of view of the off-taker. I think that for me the challenge is that means that actually the change in law risk is sitting with the project. And that means that if basically the off-taker reduces the offtake in the future or the volumes in the future, the project might not be able to repay the debt, right? So I fully understand the approach, but I think that creates a relevant challenge for us. And then basically we'll need to see how this risk can be mitigated, because also there is a cascade effect. What I mean is that probably if one off-taker wants to reduce the volume, so to terminate the contract, the other off-takers might do the same, right? So it's not like if you are looking at other asset classes like renewables, where you can just say, look, I terminate my PPA and I can move, or I can look for another one that is looking for this PPA. I think that if here we are claiming that this is happening because of a change in law, probably there is something intrinsically wrong with the project in the current or in the new regulation that prevents it from being viable. So I think that this is a big risk and something that can definitely hinder bankability. So it's something that needs proper mitigation and a lot of work around. Probably there is not a magic solution, and it would be, or what it would require is to have some dedicated work with everyone sitting on the table, and trying to get to a compromise.
Yeah, I'm guessing this is probably actually a big sticking point for a lot of projects, given policy is such a big component and it does have an essential uncertainty around it. Maybe I'll punt over to Katie actually quickly, just get your thoughts on it. You mentioned policy risk. What's the insurances, or how does insurance think about trying to help mitigate policy risk? Or is that something that insurance can help on?
So rather than specific policy, if I speak about political risk more generally, I think Abano made a really great point there of the importance of having everybody around the table to make that determination of who's got the appetite for which bits of that risk. If there's a discomfort between two stakeholders, maybe we need 5 at the table, right, to say who's comfortable to take what. So from an insurance perspective, there are products called political risk insurance. So if, for example, there is a change in government in a country and an appropriation of asset happens, those kinds of risks can be covered. It's not directly something that's going to solve this problem, but there's clearly some appetite in the insurance industry for similar types of risk. So how can we actually think about the transfer of the right bits to the industry? So yeah, there could be a solution there.
Interesting. Yeah, I think this is one that projects will have to, this is why everybody should be engaged early on in the discussions to get these projects across the line, I think is my takeaway from this. I know we only have a couple minutes left and there's a lot of questions, so we will not get to them all, but we'll try and circle up later perhaps and see if there's some we could address afterwards. Maybe one more or a few more, one next ones to take. There's a question for Paul and Alfonso. Do you have, how do you understand the capacity for SAF production near airport infrastructure from the point of view of demand and production capacity? So considering the scale of the necessary infrastructure that could constrain the safety of air operations. Cost, even with the best technology, will certainly be a strong component in any of the projects of this type. Any thoughts on that one, Paul, Alfonso?
I'm happy to start. I'm sure Alfonso can add to it. So one of the things to remember is that SAF actually is a blend component. It is not something that can just be used straight in aircraft. So the first thing to think about is, from a producer perspective, what is your downstream supply chain? Where are you going to take that blend component and get it blended? You don't want to blend that actually on the airport, because once it's blended on the airport, you then, if there's any problems, then you've got a problem with how you're going to get that off the airport. So the whole production side of things, and then getting it to a plane, is a process that needs to be followed. That's why you talk to the off-takers. They'll also talk to the actual fuel providers. So, Jonathan's team may or may not be actually moving the physical product. They're buying it, but there'll be some intermediary that will be taking that product and moving it. And as we all know, there's a lot of regulation around, quite rightly for safety reasons, around aviation fuel. So taking the blend component, blending it, testing it, et cetera, all needs to be done. So I don't see it really being associated with a particular airport or having to be near an airport. You've got to get the blend component into the aviation fuel pool and then get that distributed.
Yeah, I completely agree, Paul. I think the aviation sector is clear, and the reason is nobody want that aircraft stop in the middle of a flight. So the regulation is really restricted in terms of the production, but also the blending, and also how do you manage and how you are able to put this fuel into the airport. So as producer, we don't have so many flexibility on this one. So this is very restricted.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think we'll probably end there because if we were to jump into another question, I'm sure we'd go over, and I'm cognizant on everybody's time. I want to give you your day back after this. It sounds like the recording will be shared in a couple of days, so definitely follow up on that. We have a lot more questions, so hopefully the discussion was great. I think there's certainly room for further discussions. We'll raise that with Roz and the SAF Congress later. But I would love to thank all of you for joining me on this webinar. I think it was really insightful, a great group to have all together, and hopefully a lot of takeaways for a lot of our listeners that are in this process of developing these facilities.